Hey Research Dragons, how you doing? So I'm going to make this other recording to show about how the three types of research that we were talking about, qualitative, quantitative, and mixed measures, can morph into each other and actually become part of a new field, create a new field, and how it helps determine different ways of evolution within psychology and within different types of sciences as well. So in the last tape I talked about psychology and law and how research in a science can help the law. So in this one we're going to talk about how to trace that, and I'm going to give you like a path from the things that I did and also how the field changed just in my short time in this career. So I started out doing qualitative research, and I worked with Lawrence Kohlberg at Harvard University, and it was a great time to be at Harvard because, you know, B.F. Skinner was there and Lawrence Kohlberg, and I don't know if you've ever heard of Kohlberg, but he's quite famous, and he did stuff on moral development, which I will put up some of his work on the portal, and you can see how it's qualitative and how it's very theoretical. He followed a lot of Piaget, and when you read it, you can really see the Piagetian influence. Carol Gillikin was also there, and she was also working on a new field in feminist psychology at the same time. So that field actually came out of other fields as well. So types of research really influence the evolution of the science. So as I was there as an undergrad, I had a professor who was really starting to get into what we called criminal psychology. And criminal psychology was all about the criminal. The focus was on the criminal. But the field that was emerging was one that looked at victims and the criminal justice system and the court system and all of those kinds of things. So it was a new field, and it was being driven and pushed by, yes, criminal psychology, but also by social psychology and cognitive psychology. I know it sounds kind of strange, cognitive psychology, but it really was getting at how people thought about different things. And then forensic psychology has always been more of an applied psychology. Not that there aren't pure research taking place, research just for the sake of research, but forensic psychology is increasingly an applied thing. So right now, I went from someone who was interested in more pure research, qualitative research, to now someone who is hardcore quantitative with a little bit of mixed measures and always toward an applied outlook. So pure research is great, and don't get me wrong, pure research is something that we all have to do, and ultimately it will morph into applied research. Just because you can't see the application at the time that you're doing pure research, you'll also see the application someday. This is true with like Einstein, physics, and I always am delighted by the story of Sir Isaac Newton when he published Principia Mathematica, which became an instant bestseller in Europe. I know it sounds rather dry, but it was a big publication. And the Tsar of Russia asked him, "Oh, this is great stuff, but what can we do with it?" And he said, "I don't know, maybe someday we'll be able to use it." And of course he's talking about theory of gravitational forces and things like that. So yeah, we did kind of come up with a way to use it. So all types of pure research can find its way to applied research, and forensic psych is pretty much an applied piece of research. So in the last video I talked about how psychology and law do butt heads a lot of time, and how that's very interesting. So that is a great example of taking something that is qualitative and turning it into quantitative. And I'm going to give you an example of that. So while I was working with my qualitative theoretical psych with Kohlberg at Harvard, I kept hearing about this professor in Toledo, Ohio. And he was doing stuff on It wasn't criminal psychology per se, but it was in that area. It was like legal psychology. They didn't even have a name for it. The American Psychological Association did not have the term forensic psychology at the time. Today it's Division 41 of the APA, and it is forensic psychology. But this was before that. This was in the 80s, and he was doing stuff that was really radical. And I called him up out of the blue and said, hey, this stuff that you're doing is kind of interesting, and I'm working with Kohlberg, and I'm looking at moral values and moral development, and I want to see if it'll fit into anything that you're doing. And he said, you know, the jury is a great template for moral values. Do jurors make decisions that are moral? And justice is basically looking at moral values. He said, that would be a good template. He said, you should come out to Toledo, Ohio. And I was like, oh my God, Ohio. I'm in Boston. What do you mean? So I got on the Massachusetts Turnpike, which is really 90. You get on that and you get off where it says Toledo. There you go. So I went to talk to him. His name was Irv Horowitz, not Hurwitz, Horowitz. And I went to University of Toledo, and in his office, his boards were made of chalk, like a chalkboard, black, and he had equations written on them. And I was looking at it, and what he had was pieces of evidence coded along three variables: probative value, which means evidence that goes right to the heart of the matter in the trial, or very relevant evidence; non-probative evidence, which would be less relevant or not relevant evidence; and then extra evidentiary factors, things like emotion of the jury or different characteristics, the meaningless kind of things that enter into a juror's decision. And he had figured out how to put a statistical value on each one of those items to see what the jurors were using. And I looked at the walls and I said, is that a path analysis? And he said, yeah, it is. I was kind of surprised. And I was like, wow, he figured out a way to take something that was legal and qualitative and turn it into a quantitative measure by way of a statistical tool, a path analysis, which is not common. So that intrigued me even more. It got me more interested in this area. And he said, you should just come over here and study this, because this is going to be the new wave of where criminal psychology and legal psychology is going. And he was right, and it is forensic psychology. But that's, one of the very early things. So forensic psychology and where we were at the time is like the bleeding edge, not the cutting edge, the bleeding edge of where it all started. So it was very interesting to be early involved in something like that. So it was really pretty cool. And it was an exciting time, like I said, to be at Harvard with Kohlberg and Skinner and Carol Gillikin. But, this new stuff was really intriguing. So I found out that there was a lot of different things, not just moral values to consider in this legal psychology, but a lot of different questions that would be answered in a way that wasn't just criminal behavior or criminal psychology or legal psychology, that it was something else. We didn't have a name for it, but it looked at a blending of a lot of different types of psychology and a lot of different types of research. Because research drives the field. I don't care what field you're in, research will drive that field. And that's exactly what was happening. And it was changing psychology along with it. So it was very exciting and very different. But here's some of the questions that we were looking at, so you can see these are the kinds of questions that we were trying to evaluate along qualitative, quantitative, what type of statistics we should use, what type of research design. So things like when you're looking at juries, how do they make decisions? What go into it? How do they evaluate evidence? What about the differences between male and female jurors, between jurors from other countries, or racial or ethnic groups, or age or education, other kinds of demographics? How do they make decisions? Is it different in criminal cases and civil cases? What happens when the evidence becomes really complex? What about bias? Where does that come in the jury? What about cognitive factors, social cognitions, ideas of justice, right and wrong? which is basically a moral question. How do they determine what is just? How do they determine an appropriate punishment or damage awards, for that matter? The idea of how much is this injury or this injustice worth? How do you make the person whole again? Do they understand the evidence? And what do they do if they don't understand the evidence? What role does education play in all of this? So he was using toxic torts, which are basically environmental pollution types of cases, as his template, and all the things that went with it. So this was civil law. And I became really interested in civil law and the forensic applications of civil law. And I was very interested in climate change, even back then, which I first started doing research about climate change in 1984. So I was really interested in that, and I knew that was going to be a thing, even though one professor told me that it wasn't a thing. So, but anyway, so we were looking at these kinds of things, and it was interesting that it came out of social cognition, social psychology, and then what happens when you get that juror and you put them in a collective unit, like a jury. So they go from the individual and how does the individual think into, well, what happens when you put that person into a group? What effect is group dynamics on that decision-making, persuasion, attitude change, deliberations, negotiation, all of those kinds of things. Is there such a thing as the 12 Angry Men effect? Like one person is going to be the holdout until they change the whole group? Research shows that that's not the way that goes. Or is it something opposite of that? Yes, research shows that, the weight of the majority comes to bear and change the opinion on the minority. Or is it something in between? So there was empirical research that looked at that. So you can see just on the evolution of forensic psychology and the morphing of different types of psychology, how a new psychology, a new field in psychology was born today, forensic psychology. So what I want you to take away from this is that research is all around you, okay? Every day, every moment, there are questions, there are things that you wonder about, and those are all a call to research. Okay, so if you wonder about something, it's telling you, hey, that thing you see on TV or in social media or in the print media or whatever, it's research rearing its head saying, hey, study me, study me. One time I was having a conversation with my family in Massachusetts, and they were talking about child sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. And they were on the side of the priests in the Catholic Church, which I found a little disturbing. And it just led me to ask questions like, well, why are they on their side? Why can't they see that this is not the way I'm looking at it? Maybe I'm looking at it wrong. Well, how are they going to solve these cases? What if this happened or that happened? So that one conversation led to 10 years of research on child sexual abuse litigation in the Catholic Church. And that got me into a whole mess of things. I was in 2 Oscar-nominated movies. I testified before Congress and the Ohio Supreme Court and a whole bunch of other kinds of things. It just turned into a big research, 10-year, a decade worth of research and all kinds of being on TV, being on NPR, being on all these different things, just because of the research I was doing. And it all came from a conversation that I had to turn into a research project. So you never know when something comes your way and you're thinking, why am I thinking about this? It's a call to research. So there you go. So I'm going to stop the video here and I'm going to continue it with the current research I'm doing, and you can see how it's morphing into other things as well. So I'll pick that up in the next video.